Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Palestine Studies, which is sponsoring another in a series of book talks. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, fellow historian, Irene Genzier, who is a professor emeritus of political science. This book, which is what you're going to hear about today, Dying to Forget Oil, Power, Palestine, and the Foundations of U.S. Policy in the Middle East, which resulted from her discoveries in the United States government archives. And what she had done was to look at materials on Palestine in the years immediately before partition and in the years immediately after the 1948 war, so for a stretch after World War II, and had discovered things that those of us who thought we knew something about Palestine often found a revelation. She's going to tell us some of these things today. I really strongly, if you have any interest in the topic of Palestine, and the topic of partition, Middle East politics in that era, I strongly suggest that you buy the book. You'll hear something about it from Irene, but there's an awful lot of material there. She discovers, for example, that the U.S. Pentagon completely changes its assessment of Israel in light of the results of the 1948 war. Things that we didn't really realize about U.S. policy, in fact, started much, much earlier than the conventional accounts, which have the United States really paying serious attention to Israel as a great power in the region only with the 1960s. She finds that this, in fact, goes back to the 40s. Things like that were, to any serious, would constitute what is, to any serious historian, a revelation. Thank you very much. Irene.
It seemed to me that anybody walking around today and coming to a talk of this kind must ask themselves, how can somebody begin to talk about 48 and not talk about what's going on now? I mean, and I was not invited to give my comments on what's going on now, but I'll sneak them in anyway. It seems to me, sort of reflecting on, how should I put it, what kind of lessons do we draw from this ongoing, shall I say, it's as though we're at the gates of hell and slowly the doors are opening. The first thing that strikes me is that we have something to learn or to be aware of in terms of our selective mourning. Everybody is in a state of grief and permanent grief, but we seem to be so, by we, I mean, I'm looking at newspaper coverage, and I happen to be of French origin myself, so I have sadness. But what about all the other events that have taken place? What about Beirut before? Or what about Yemen? What about Iraq? What about Syria? Why are we selective? And it's, the selectivity of the mourning comes with something more. It comes with something that I've often found disturbing and not really known how to talk about. And that is a kind of indifference about what a colleague of mine calls the deaths of others. It's the title of his book. The man is John Truman. And more generally, I don't know of any course in political science or international relations, a field even worse than political science, that deals with the consequences of wars. I mean, we're very good at analyzing and new analyses of strategy and so on and so on. But what about the human results of the wars? What about being able not so much to tally and to quantify the number of people who become dysfunctional, as they say in polite language, but the terrible despair that comes from those who are permanently uprooted and maddened and displaced and exist nowhere as a result of wars. We seem not to think about them. And so when you get waves of refugees, suddenly this is as though a new category has been invented. We are now dealing with a category called refugee. So we'll have courses and seminars on refugees, who they are, where they come from, how they behave, and so on. part of what is associated with this is a kind of dehumanization that is also familiar to many of us. So it happened that while I was brooding over these developments, like everyone else, kind of glued to the bad news and wondering if it could get worse as it got worse, I was reading Kamel Daoud's book on Meursault. Some of you know it. Why do I mention it? Because it seemed to me that, in a sense, he captures in that book something which is terribly important. The namelessness. He's talking about Camus and Contre Camus and Camus d'étranger, but in his book, in the definition of Meursault and the whole retelling of the tale of Camus étranger, there is not just an attempt. It's the whole point of his book, it seems to me, to give a name, a face, a history of the party that was involved in this otherwise nameless act that Camus talks about. So in the process, as you read his account, you understand that he's not talking about an event. He's talking about he's talking about a series of disconcerting events. What I'm looking for right now is Roger Cohen, July description of the Meursault account. Let me just see if I have it here. Forget about Meursault and listen to what he says. This was published July 25th. At the core of any conflict lies invisibility. The enemy cannot be seen, at least not if seeing betokens the start of understanding. The other is there, a menacing and inevitable presence, but it's invisible in his or her human dimensions. Demonization blocks any glimmer of shared humanity or sympathy. Only when the nameless foe becomes a man or a woman, confronted with the puzzle of life, does the path to understanding begin to open. No gun was turned to plowshare without some form, some tentative attempt of mutual recognition. I don't need to go on with it, but you get the idea. This is Cohen talking about what the effect of reading Meursault is on him. This, of course, opens the door that many, many people who are in this room, some of whom I know, can speak to far better than I can. When we begin to think about what are the implications of what I've just said for beginning to understand what is going on, not only in Paris, but further east, then we run into other kinds of questions, like how do we know what we know? How do we know what we don't know? How do we know who is the human being there? How does the human being who is there look or act or seem and so on? And where do we know it from? If you have a spare 8 hours per day, you can spend your time on the web and read the newspaper and go to work in between. If you have another spare 12 hours, you can go to the archives like me and then hope that somebody pulls you out eventually, right? But the thing that is no laughing matter is that if we rely on media and academia, and they're both complicit in different ways, we're in real difficulty, because it's not until we have sufficient experience to be in a position to evaluate what it is they didn't tell us about what is going on. So let me just give you a few examples to get to 1948. I want to read you just a few, where did I put these things now here? A few items that came out in November that I have here in my neat pile that I can't find, but I will in a moment. Well, let me begin with, let's say between July and the present time, there have been a series of articles about what happened in Palestine, the number of deaths, the medical relief, the information that he put out calling for assistance. I don't recall seeing anything of this kind in the New York Times. I do remember seeing a lot of discussion about the so-called cycle of violence, which made it sound as though there are two groups of equal whatever it is that are at each other, but this was hardly the case. Do you remember that there were IDF, Israel Defense Forces generals, trying to tell Netanyahu that the reason for the uprising of the Palestinians was their level of despair? That was the generals of the IDF. They could qualify for, coverage in the Times, but I don't recall seeing anything of that kind there. Not to speak of the articles about those Israeli reservists who decided that they refused to serve, and that's not news. So if you follow events, you may know something about them. But if you haven't followed, why would you begin to know? In the same way that if you live in the U.S., you know that at the grassroots level, this country is seething with activity. There are groups that meet. There are individuals, all kinds of collective assortments of people who get together to talk about what's going on, who have various interests, and who are very politically aware. Not knowing anything about them and not covering what they do adds to the impression that we're fairly passive and we're just there sort of waiting to be told. So when Netanyahu came and he spoke before the Center for American Progress, you remember that there was a lot of opposition to that, well-mobilized opposition to it. And while he was there, he mentioned the fact that he was really not responsible in his administration for the number of settlements, the increase in the number of settlements. Well, yeah, right. So it seemed somewhat a bit surprising, but perhaps more surprising was the fact that a liberal Zionist group such as Americans for Peace Now came out with a very, very strong response. They not only took him up on it, but they also identified the number of settlements that had been established. Not to speak of Haaretz. Haaretz, really, the Israeli liberal paper, really should qualify as a subversive paper, and maybe it does because there's so little reference to it in the U.S. But Peter Beinart said even more in that newspaper. So with these random remarks, what's the connection between this and my own work? Well, the connection is really very, very, very easy to discover. The connection is this: the material on 48 that I have used and that Rashid has been so complimentary about. It's all in the public domain. I discovered very, very little. I mean, I happened to turn pages and use them and decide to expand on them or investigate them. But I can't say that, thanks to some foundation, I have spent years in the caves of X digging out secrets that were so well buried that there are no secrets. Everything I've used comes from declassified documents. I have to ask myself, I have all kinds of nasty answers, but I would rather not share them at this point as to why others didn't discover the same things. But there is a lot to discover. I titled my book Dying to Forget, and I was asked a reasonable question: how can you die to forget? Either you die because you want to forget, or you die because you have forgotten. My point is that in some collective way, so I'm taking artistic or whatever it is, license, to say that collectively, we who have access to this material know, but we choose not to look. And we choose not to look because the upshot of what is revealed in this material does not at all fit the commonplace historical account or what passes for it of U.S. policy in the formation of the State of Israel. So that, that in a nutshell is perhaps one of the most that's one of the things I found exceedingly interesting. Of course, let me go over this maybe now in a more systematic way. One thing which is perhaps not a surprise is the role of oil in U.S. policy following World War II. That is, U.S. policy in the Middle East, I argue, was formed under that heading. Certainly with respect to developments in the Eastern Mediterranean, including from Greece to Turkey further east, the understanding was, even before Truman Doctrine and all this language, not to speak of NSC 68, oil is a weapon of war, as one of the committees of the Defense Department phrased it. There's an understanding that access and control by U.S. companies is essential. It's not essential for U.S. domestic use because the oil was not used domestically. It was designed to be used for the Marshall Plan and for U.S. policy in Japan. Those of you who work on the subject of oil also know that it was exceedingly useful because it was far cheaper to produce than the domestic oil. But that's the starting point. So then the question arises, where does Palestine fit in? Does it fit in? And I'm arguing that U.S. policy in the area of Palestine fits in a double way. First of all, there was an understanding in the Department of State and those very, very few people who constituted the special experts dealing with the Palestine conflict and with the, let's say, the conflict more generally. According to J.C. Hurwitz, who used to teach at Columbia some years ago, in his book, The Struggle for Palestine, he claims that there were really only 2 folders that he found in the State Department dealing with this, this conflict. But the understanding was that Palestine, by virtue of its location, was something to be concerned with. But there was also a clear understanding that Palestine, by virtue of the fact that it was a British mandate, was not something that the U.S. would be stepping into until the British decided to leave. They decided to leave, if you remember, also they did leave definitively in 1948. But prior to that, even in 1945, there were a succession of very clear statements made by various people in the Department of State and the CIA when it was formed in 1947 to the effect that the Palestine question is one of the most important questions facing us, even more so than Berlin. That's a dramatic statement. So if I can find my pages on evidence on this, I'll read them to you. But it begins in that way. There is between 45, 46, 47, 48 repeated assertions among this small group of policymakers, and I'll say something about who's included there, that this region where there is a conflict that is whose origins are very clearly understood, this is something that we cannot ignore. When between the partition plan, November 29th, 47, that's UN Resolution 181, and the period following Israel's declaration of independence on May 14th, in that interim and after, U.S. officials are also in receipt of information about the emerging refugee problem, which they take very, very, very seriously. Now, let me backtrack for a moment. One of the things I found most striking in the way in which officials discussed the conflict. It's totally unlike what you might hear today. There's no discussion of religion. There's no discussion of Sunni, Shiite, Muslims, forget it. The discussion is a political conflict among incompatible groups. One, people who live on the land. The other, the Zionist movement. This was not an expression of anti-Israel Zionist or anti-Semitic sentiment. It was presented by individuals who maybe were even unalike in their orientation, but simply as a matter of observation. We are faced with a conflict. What should be our position in the conflict? Some, like Evan Wilson, who wrote about this in the context of other accounts of U.S. policy, claimed that in 1945-46, the U.S., that is, so while Britain is still present, and the Truman administration, 1945, has just sent out Earl Harrison to do a study of Jewish refugees that results in something called the Harrison Report. In this context, while considering this, you had officials saying, "Look, we have to find a compromise." The position of Jewish refugees, as Gordon Merriam, who was then in the division of North African and Middle Eastern division of the State Department, according to Merriam, that's an international problem. We can't deal with it alone. Sounds familiar, right? We have to do something about that. We have a problem with immigration. That also sounds familiar. He didn't say more at the time, but there was more that was very familiar. There was a hostility to immigration, hostility to the immigration of Jews in the U.S. and many other places. So sad stories. In the midst of that, people like Merriam and Evan Wilson were saying, for Palestine, okay, 100,000 Jews should go from Europe immediately into Palestine, which the British didn't regard as a gift, but as some kind of a curse from the Americans who don't know up from down, who don't know what the hell they're doing. Don't record that. And who are going to spoil things for us. So a lot of opposition there, and often a different track comes the continuation of that conflict. So on the one hand, you have people saying, wait a minute, Earl Harrison report, that's not enough. Let's have an Anglo-American committee looking into what should be done in Palestine, and let's pursue that line. And on another hand, you have people saying, look, in Palestine, we think there should be a binational solution. We think that's the only possibility of finding a way out. This is at the time when there is also beginning to be agitation in favor of partition. So another revelation, there was no one in the U.S. except for the small circle of advisors to Truman who were close to him. They're all named, they're always well known, David Niles among them. Others opposed partition, consistently opposed partition. The CIA's view of partition was that it would endanger U.S. interests in the region because it would alienate Arab oil producers. So, lesson number 2, a familiar one, but with an unfamiliar dimension. The familiar one is a story that the American State Department, intelligence, and military viewed partition and developments in Palestine under the rubric of interest in oil, that's familiar, and feared that any partition of Palestine, any emergence of a Jewish state would totally undermine U.S. oil interests. The revelation turns out to be false. After May 48, Aramco and U.S. oil companies expanded their holdings in the Gulf. That's not what one would expect. But then maybe also one would not have expected at this period for the Saudis to let the American oil companies and State Department know that they made a very cool distinction between, on the one hand, commercial interests and political interests. So you got the message? The message is we have commercial interests. And so on. That's a brilliant move, and it has long-range consequences, and you're familiar with the consequences. That was heard, and it was understood, as you no doubt understand it. The upshot was, we don't need to worry about Arab cancellation of concessions, which is precisely what U.S. oil companies were worried about. One of the things I discovered, which I think is important for the study of policymaking, and that is that there are circles outside of policymakers that also influence policy. We're accustomed to thinking in terms of lobbies and so on, but I'm not thinking about lobbies. What I'm thinking is this. I discovered that there was a very interesting a meaningful exchange between the individual who was the head of the oil and gas division of the Interior Department, a man by the name of Max Bohl, who had as part of his responsibility informing the president, Truman, about developments, international and national developments with respect to oil. That's a vast responsibility. There were at least 39 different agencies that had been established to deal with oil. He had no political appointment other than the title that I was just given. He did have an encounter, which the origin which I'll describe in a moment, with the number 2 representative of the Jewish Agency in the U.S. in 1948, a man by the name of Eliyahu Epstein, who later became Eliyahu Eilat. That relationship was, I think, very important. It's not a conspiracy. It's not secret. You can find out about it by, leave this meeting, go immediately to Logan Airport, head for the Truman Library, and also go downtown and you don't even need to go to the Israeli consulate. You can just go to Columbia's library and look for the Israeli version of the Foreign Relations of the U.S., 1948, and you'll find the text of the correspondence between these people and what it meant. Okay, so I began talking about oil and this interesting connection, but let me pursue this again, coming back to the subject of partition, the opposition to partition. Partition took place, right? And you know the vote, and there's a lot of, continues to be a lot of controversy over the extent of pressure applied by U.S. officials on different foreign delegations at the United Nations. Let's pass on that. The partition vote passes. Again, one of the interesting discoveries I made in various sources that I read was the extent of coverage on the ground by U.S. consuls. We're familiar with the importance of the work of Benny Morris and Ilan Pape and Tom Segev and others. But there were U.S. consuls, Thomas Wasson was one, assassinated on May 23rd, 1948, in conditions never really investigated. But he happened to be in Jerusalem at that period. Robert McAtee, who succeeded him, these people were sending, as part of their jobs, regular reports to the State Department, to the Secretary of State, what I see. And what they saw was an increasing level of violence. Accounts of Palestinians attacking Jews, Jewish settlers in buses, in all kinds of places, in violent and ostensibly nonviolent encounters. But they also saw and also reported on the mobilization by different Jewish groups, the Haganah, the Irgun, the Stern Gang, acts of atrocities, as in the case of Deir Yassin, April 9th, 1948, that Thomas Wasson reported on in great detail and sent to Washington. The result in Washington is an increasing discussion between Marshall, the Secretary of State, and Loy Henderson in the State Department, among others, Robert McClintock, Dean Rusk, about what should we do. The British are still there. We know we have a Jewish population in the U.S. that is sympathetic and supportive of the idea of a Jewish state, but we're very worried about this. The memos that go to Washington from Wasson, among others, are not just chronicles of violence. They are reports of flight and expulsions of refugees, and they're documented, and they're collected. By January, February 48, Atchison was saying, we're going to have a terrible time. This is going to be a terrible year. The news gets back to Tel Aviv, and Ben-Gurion, as the de facto head of not only the Jewish Agency, but what will become the Labor Party later, consults with his colleagues and concludes, we have to do something immediately to organize our supporters in the U.S. to make sure that the U.S. does not renege on partition. Because in January and February 48, there was talk about, let's bring the Palestine case back to the General Assembly and call for a temporary trusteeship. This was regarded with much hesitation among U.S. officials, including the legal advisor to the State Department, who said, this is going to make us look very bad. I mean, you call for essentially a statement of self-incrimination about your error in having supported partition. Nothing is done, but there's a lot of talk about the desirability, the risk of. I'm saying that in the decision on the part of Ben-Gurion to send someone to the U.S. to see what can be done turns out to be a brilliant political move. Moshe Chertok is in the U.S., so is Eliyahu Epstein, and they get to work. So Eliyahu Epstein is the person I mentioned before who meets Max Bohl. Parenthetically, okay, it's interesting gossip to know how they met, but that's not essential now. The important thing is that they meet. And I say Bohl is outside of the policymaking institution, but Eliyahu Epstein, when he meets him, says basically, look, we need your help. We would like the Americans to understand that they misunderstand our motives and the extent to which we can support U.S. policy in the Middle East rather than constitute a risk for such policy. Well, them there is important words, because the view of the Zionist movement and of the idea of creating a Jewish state was precisely that it would endanger oil, U.S. oil interests. And Epstein presents what is in effect called the Notes on Palestine, a new policy, a new look. And it was a very intelligent statement, not suggesting, but indicating that the Americans had the whole thing reversed. The fear was not that the Arabs would turn against the Americans and drop their concessions, but rather the problem was that the Americans didn't understand the extent to which the Saudis, for example, were dependent on the U.S. If the dependence was the reverse, then what was the basis of the fear? There was none. It was a fear based on misunderstanding. The correct understanding was that given the extent to which Arabs, oil-producing regions, were dependent on U.S. companies for the production, transport, and sale of their oil, if that was correctly understood, where was the problem? Bohl was very impressed. This information about the connection between Max Bohl and different people in the Zionist movement, including his later meeting with Ben-Gurion. I'm not the first who wrote about that. This was mentioned in an article that I found of enormous interest by Nathan Citino, who's now teaching at Rice University, who has a special interest in oil. And in my exchanges with him, he kept saying to me, you've got to come here. There's a mountain of material on oil that you need to look at. I didn't pursue it. I felt that I had more than I could handle, but it stayed in my mind. No doubt there is more along these lines. I mention this in case somebody here is in a position to decide to pursue this. In any case, back home in D.C., so you are now in January, February, March, April. The news is getting worse. but the idea of a trusteeship has not been dropped. It has not been implemented. At this point, it's important to meet someone else who has a role here, far better known, perhaps than others, Clark Clifford. I'm sure that those of you who read some of this material are familiar with him. Legal counsel to the president, not holding a policy-making position. On May 12th, just a few days before Israel declares its independence, Truman calls a special meeting in his office. And he tells Clark, look, I want you to present a case for U.S. support for Jewish statehood. And because you know that the Department of State, they're going to present the opposite case. We're going to have a meeting. It's very important. And George Marshall walks into the president's office and says to Truman, what's that man doing there? He has no official position. And Truman tells him, he's here because I invited him to come. When the meeting is over, some writers were under the impression that Truman had been persuaded by Marshall that support for the continued existence of partition and the emergence of a Jewish state would be profoundly inimical to U.S. interests. And as the evidence, included in the evidence that he provided, was data on the refugees. Now, in addition to the data on the refugees, U.S. officials, the ones that I've just mentioned, had been in touch with Jewish officials of the Zionist movement, of the Jewish Agency, on the subject of the refugees. And they had, I would say, also clarity with respect to what the position of the Jewish Agency was at the time. It was the same as it would be after May 14th, which was briefly, we are not responsible for the creation of the refugee problem. It's a function of Palestinian and Arab hostility towards us and the response to their own leaders. We take no responsibility for it, and we are systematically opposed to the idea of any repatriation beyond a very limited number for family reasons, and we stand on that. Clark, meanwhile, so here this man outside the establishment understands that things have reached a very, very tight point. He recommends, if you want, here's another revelation, he recommends to Epstein to inform the Jewish Agency leadership in Tel Aviv to go ahead with the unilateral declaration of independence. And that is what happens. And once that declaration takes place, it of course undermines any possibility of trusteeship or any such thing. We're in a new phase. So you have by May 48, I would say, a small policy-making elite in the State Department, among the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the Department of Defense, that are collectively hostile to the idea of a Jewish state. The Jewish state is declared. Among the people who wrote a great deal about this and presented their views to the President and the Secretary of State was Philip Jessup. Jessup was then representative of the U.S. at the UN. In July, Jessup presented a very strong case why the U.S. should do everything it can. This is July, several months after Israel's declaration of independence, everything it can to pressure the provisional government of Israel to take in Palestinian refugees, in other words, repatriation. The subject of repatriation is a dominant theme in the American literature. Again, it disappears from view. We understand now that if the presidential candidate uses the word Palestine, their assistant will say it was an error of judgment, it was some, misunderstanding. The word really meant something else, Philistine or something. Nothing of the kind in the period I'm talking about. So I mentioned Jessup because in the summer of 48, you begin to sense that something is changing. Something is changing. What's changing is that the American officials who had been so systematically set against partition, against Truman's rapid recognition of Israel, begin to speak differently. By 1949, well, first of all, in the interim, as a result of Bernadotte's efforts at the UN, there's been quite a keen effort on the subject of getting armistice agreements. There are armistice agreements between Israel, Transjordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt. And there is someone assigned, Mark Etheridge, journalist from St. Louis, assigned by the U.S. to be head of the U.S. Delegation to the Lausanne Conference. The purpose of the Lausanne Conference is to transform those agreements into a permanent settlement. Etheridge is a true believer in the desirability of a permanent settlement. He's also a true believer in the urgency of Palestinian refugee repatriation. Everyone in the various departments that I mentioned is on record as supporting repatriation. Until 1949, roughly speaking, even less than a year after Israel's emergence, the Joint Chiefs of Staff come out with a very cool statement saying, the emergence of the State of Israel has radically altered the balance of power in the region. The U.S. did not have a policy with respect to Israel. It must formulate such a policy at the present time. To skip ahead, they go on to suggest that the location of Israel, its location, is highly desirable. It has a small number of bases that could be desirable, but more than that, it has demonstrated by virtue of its effective fighting forces, its militias, that in number were far less than comparable Arab forces. It has nevertheless demonstrated its efficiency, its discipline, and its ability to succeed. We can use, potentially, we could use this new state in the protection of our interests against our prime enemy, the Soviet Union, in the area of the Middle East. Now, I'm not quoting, so I'm conflating different positions. But what that adds up to is it's a transformation. But it's calculated. It's a deliberate assessment that, look, what counts is our oil interests. Yes, this upheaval has changed this part of the world as far as we're concerned. We can use it for our benefit. How does this translate into affecting the U.S. position on the Palestinians? There had been a regular sort of, with remarkable repetition and cadence, you've got to accept, to the Israelis, you've got to accept UN General Assembly Resolution 194, that's December 11th, 1948, on repatriation. You have to make sure that, this is the American officials saying to the Israelis, you have to make sure that any changes you make with respect to territory is compensated, that you just don't extend your territory. And by the way, we also support the internationalization of Jerusalem. And we insist that you support the internationalization of Jerusalem. This is now a UN resolution. All that is never taken off the table. It's just totally subverted. So that Truman, by 1949, indicates to Robert Lovett, acting Secretary of State, saying, if you consult with the provisional government of Israel and make any recommendations with respect to any changes whatsoever, you must obtain their permission. You must obtain their acknowledgement. And that's the end of the story. It's not the end of the story, it's the beginning of the story. But what I'm suggesting is that, again, there's a logic to it. There's a design. It's not a mystery. The understanding was, and by the way, I would not say that this comes out of any great love or hatred of Jews or Arabs. My sense is, if you take somebody like McClintock, who played an important role in Lebanon in '58, there's a contempt for both. These people are screwing things up in an area that's important for us. It's not so much profound historical emotion in one direction or another. But I think that what one is left with, and it's the beginning rather than the end of the story, of course, is that by 1949, there was both clarity about the nature of the conflict, clarity about the obstacles to its resolution, and clarity about the advantages that the existing balance of power offered to the United States. There was the Israeli government requested arms. That offer was declined. They requested financial assistance. They would obtain $100 million at the time, but nothing. This is not equivalent to what happens when the so-called special relationship is established many years later. This is not the beginning of a special relationship. I'm arguing simply it is the beginning of a relationship that is understood for what it is. Now, to be fair in the sense of, as an historian, you want to look at the larger picture. What was happening with respect to U.S. foreign policy in the world at the time. 1945, we're under the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1949, it's the revolution in China. And some U.S. officials were saying, by the way, apropos the refugee crisis, that could go the way of China, which is an interesting thought at the time. So I'd like to leave you with this story and look forward to your questions. Thank you.